to talk about design today, and before I launch into talking about it, I want to explain that I've spent a lot of my career coming up with ways to characterize the language of design using different words. And basically, I've done that because the language of design did not feel that familiar to me when I first started to study. So I knew intellectually what unity was, but I couldn't keep the term unity in my head. And as I taught, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had this issue, that a lot of people found the design terminology slightly separate from how they related to the work they were making. And I think language is evolving all the time. So I started thinking about how to explain concepts to people using language that's about how human beings react and interact. And so I want to talk to you about contrast and relationship, but I don't think that those are two terms that are going to be familiar with how you've thought about or been introduced to design ideas in the past. But basically, contrast and relationship are two sides of one whole. Contrast is what makes a picture interesting, and picture I'm using very broadly. Picture could be a quilt, picture could be a stitchery, picture could be a painting, picture could be a photograph, fill in the blank, whatever you make, that's your picture. Contrast is what makes it interesting. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and minimalism is a movement where the paintings were very specifically colored and shaped and reduced down so that they were very minimal. So contrast wasn't playing a very big role in the minimalist movement. But in general, when we think about the work we make, we want to keep contrast in mind because it will make our work more interesting. That's what makes work interesting. And there are 7 basic ways to create the contrast. The first is color. So if I have 2 colors on one surface, I've already created contrast. The second one is value. And value, of course, is adding either white or black or gray to a color. So if I have some red and I add white to it and make it pink, and I have that same red and I add black to it and I make it a darker version of red, then I've already created a value scale. And that can just be 3 versions of that red, or it could be 23 versions of that red based on how much white or gray or black I added. But I have contrast based on those various values. The third element is size. And so if I have small squares and medium squares and large squares, or small leaves, medium leaves, large leaves, if I have an assortment of sizes, I've created contrast. And you know how interesting this is because if you've ever walked down a street when the leaves have fallen, in the autumn, wherever you are, and you look down, you've got some color contrast happening there, and then you have different sizes of the leaves. And so it's fairly straightforward understanding size. Then we also have shape, that's number 4. And shape means I can have circles and I can have squares, or I can have leaves that are very simple shapes, or I can have leaves like a maple that are much more complex. And it isn't just leaves and geometric shapes, it's everything. So shape is another way to create contrast. Then I have texture. And texture, I think of 2 ways. There's contrast that's real texture. So if I have a rough piece of burlap and I have a smooth piece of silk, or I have a very highly polished and sanded wood surface, and then I have a rough wood surface, I have real contrast related to the texture. But we can also have what I think of as faux texture, and that's F-A-U-X, French word, meaning, I'm not sure it means fake, but close enough to get the idea. Faux texture means that it looks like a texture even though it isn't. So if I take a photograph of a piece of burlap and I put that photograph collaged into a composition, I might have a lot of different textures, but in fact the entire surface is smooth because they're all photographs that have been cut and pieced together. And so that's an example of a texture that isn't really a texture, it just looks like texture. Now, the 6th component is what I think of as stylistic contrast. And the easiest way to think about that in this day and age is to imagine that I type out a line of A's on the computer screen, and then I change each of those little A's into a different font. So stylistically, they're all different. Another way to think about stylistic differences is the difference between periods in furniture, for example. So we have a modern aesthetic, and we have Queen Anne furniture, and we have an Asian aesthetic where the furniture is quite different, and that can have something to do with clothing. There are Victorian styles. There are as many different styles of clothing and furniture and home decor as there are styles of making art. There can be contrast because there are two styles that may be at odds with each other, and when that happens, that's one of the first places that beginner's work goes off track, because we haven't organized the stylistic components in such a way that they tell a story together. And so one of the things that we want to tune in on when we're doing design work is to make sure that if the styles are very high contrast, there's a reason for it and it can be defended. The last contrast is created in a way that I describe as being thematic. And if there's thematic contrast, it means that there are a lot of different elements, but they're not like each other. And so an example that I could use here is that I might have a beautiful piece of silk that I dyed, and it was a beautiful sort of a pagoda Chinese red color, which I think is a color that most of us have a frame of reference for in the most respectful way. And I may decide that I want to do some printing on that background, and so I look up online and I find one of these maps that's lines that indicates elevation, typographical map. And I use that topographical map to create a screen, and I print that on the red fabric that I have. So now I have two contrasting elements. I have the background color and I have this design, the topographical map. And then I think I want to add something that's maybe a little bit contrasting in terms of value. So I make a lighter color of paint of the red, and then I print an element, perhaps a fan. And then the next element is perhaps the Chinese character for fan, and I add that. And so all of the elements are different from each other, but they're all fitting together into the composition. So those are the 7 elements of contrast. Now here's the really cool thing. Relationship is the part of the composition, the approach to composing, that holds all the parts together so that they make sense and they don't seem like just this odd, random bunch of things that you assembled. And the points of relationship are exactly the same qualities that we use to create contrast. So we can use color to build relationship, which can be done by choosing colors that have tried and true relationship, like complementary colors, for example. We can order the values so that we have value from light to dark on the composition that we're creating, and that builds a sense of relationship. We can have size, which means that maybe some of the elements that are used in this composition are all very close in size, and that's where the relationship comes from. And then if they're also staggered value-wise, you can see that we're building relationship more than one way. If we have shape, we're building relationship by using shapes that are similar to each other. So it could be, back to the leaf idea, they're all leaves, and so that builds relationship, but in the most fabulous sort of way, we're also developing contrast because the leaves are different shapes. So we have shape, and then we have texture. If I use that piece of burlap that I referenced alongside a photograph or a screen, a printing screen that I made from the burlap, then I have relationship because it's the same element, it's the same image, but I've got 2 versions of it working. Stylistically, I can build my entire composition around a particular stylistic aesthetic. And so I can look at those letters that I talked about, and I can use the same font throughout, and I can vary all the letters. So then I have contrast, but I also have relationship. And from a thematic standpoint, the example that I gave you of dyeing the red fabric and printing the topographical map, and then using a character for a fan, and then having a fan that perhaps I cut and turned into a silk screen or stenciled. The fact is, all of those elements that I'm combining are related to each other to tell the story thematically and move it forward. And so that's where the importance of relationship comes in when we're putting something together that we want to be integrated from a thematic standpoint. Now, the most beautiful thing about what you can do as an artist is that you can take these elements, these 7 elements, and you can use some of them to create contrast, and you can use some of them to create relationship. And you can do this on one piece, within the structure of one piece. So you've got the strategies of using color, and you've got the strategies of using value, and you're using those not only to build relationship, but you're using them so that they also create contrast simultaneously. It's the most wonderful enclosed system with numerous, I would say probably endless possibilities. What I'd like to do is walk through one piece with you and talk about the elements of contrast and relationship so that you have a real-time example of how these concepts work together to strengthen your work and make it more interesting and more cohesive for the viewer, but also a total kick for you as the artist to create. Let's take a look at some work.